Today we're working brioche flat, back and forth. Brioche stitch is one of my favorite stitches in knitting, and it can confuse a lot of people because structurally it's a little bit different than traditional knitted fabric. So today I'm going to show you how to work brioche knitting back and forth, meaning right side and wrong side rows. If you'd like to see our tutorial for knitting brioche circularly or in the round, we'll include that link in the comments below. So let's talk a little bit about what brioche is. I've got a nice big piece of brioche fabric here. Brioche appears to the untrained eye in the same way as a 1x1 rib, in that every other stitch presents as a column of knits, and in between those columns you have what appears as a purl column. So it looks from a distance like 1x1 ribbing, but it is worked slightly differently than 1x1 ribbing. You can work brioche in a single color, which is what we're doing today, and you can also work it in two colors. I have a sample of two-color brioche here as well, just to give you an idea of a visual of those ribs. You see the lighter yellow here is the knit stitch, and the darker is the purl stitch, and on the other side it's reversible, but those two are flipped. So here I have a swatch of brioche stitch that I've been working, and I'm going to demo the technique for you here, and then afterwards I'm going to go back and show you how to do a cast on for a brioche setup like this. I'm showing you from here first just because it's easier to read your fabric as I'm teaching you the 2-row repeat. So a brioche stitch is a 2-stitch repeat, knits and purls essentially, and a 2-row repeat, a right side and a wrong side row. So I'm going to show you those 2 rows first, then we'll go back and show how to cast on for a piece of brioche stitch. So one thing that you'll notice when you're working brioche is that you'll see a sort of unusual setup of the live stitches. If you follow any of the knit columns up and look at the live stitch above a knit column, you'll see that it looks like you have a double stitch. You have a stitch that is a yarn over on the live stitch that is coming out of the knit, and the stitches that are coming out of the purl bumps are regular. So you sort of get this alternating look of a single stitch and a double stitch, a single stitch and a double stitch all the way across. So that's something that I want to point out right away so you're aware that that's not a mistake. That's how your live row of stitches is always going to look during brioche. You're always going to have that alternating double, single, and you're about to see why. So I'm working an edge stitch on my fabric here where I'm just knitting the first and last stitch of this swatch every row just to keep it nice and tidy. Your pattern will probably tell you what you need to be doing on the edge stitch. You don't have to use an edge stitch when using brioche. It's just something that I personally like to do. So I'm going to work that first edge stitch. Now, the first stitch of the pattern is a knit column that I encounter. And as we talked about before, I have this stitch plus a corresponding yarn over, and I'm going to knit those two together. So it feels like I'm doing a knit two together. And now I'm at a purl stitch, and I'm not actually going to be working that stitch. I'm going to be slipping it. But before I do, I'm going to bring my yarn to the front, slip the purl stitch, and then bring my yarn over the back like I'm making a normal yarn over. And so when I go in to work this next stitch, I'm going to be creating that yarn over this slip stitch that I just did. So create that yarn over, go into the knit stitch and its corresponding yarn over, knit those two together, slide off, bring the yarn forward, slip one, this is the one that presents as a purl, and then with my yarn in back, I'm creating that yarn over right there on the needle as I work the next stitch. So go into the next stitch, knit those two together, bring yarn forward, slip one, yarn to back, yarn over, and that's all there is to brioche. You're going to be doing this on both sides over and over. So every stitch that presents as a purl column, I'm slipping and bringing the yarn over top of the needle. Every stitch that presents as a knit column, which is going to have 2 stitches up here on my needle, 1 live stitch and 1 yarn over, is going to be worked together. So as you start to get comfortable working brioche, it becomes very rhythmic. You can see I bring my yarn forward, slip one, go into the next to knit, and just as I'm knitting it, I'm creating that yarn over over the purl stitch. And we do that over and over until we reach the end of the row. That's a right side row. Okay, I'm getting to the end of my fabric, and as I said earlier, I have an edge stitch on mine, so I got to that very last stitch, and I'm just going to work it, keeping that in just a simple garter stitch edge along the side. Okay, that's row 1. Now, row 2, you're basically doing the exact same thing, but from the other side. So everything that you had just worked on this side that was presenting as a knit now presents as a purl on this side. So again, we do the same thing. Start that edge stitch, which is just a simple knit stitch. Now, this time, the first stitch in my row reads as a purl. And you can see it's a single live stitch on my needle. Anytime you see that single live stitch, you know you're going to be slipping it and yarning over. So I'm going to bring my yarn to the front, slip, bring yarn over, and then now my next stitch is a knit. You can see it comes from a knit column and therefore has the double stitch here, the stitch and its yarn over from the last row we just worked. And I'm going to go in and work those together and continue in that manner. So now I'm at a purl, bring the yarn to the front, slip one, yarn over, and then now I'm going to work the knit together with its corresponding yarn over. So you see, as we're working across the wrong side row, row 2, we're actually doing the exact same thing we were doing on row 1. And for that reason, knitting brioche flat is slightly simpler than knitting brioche circularly, because you're doing the same thing on both sides. In circular, you need to do a little, one extra step. And so here we go all the way across. Okay, and my second to last stitch is a purl, so I'm slipping it with my yarn over, and then I got my edge stitch for there, which again, I'm working in garter stitch. I'm just knitting it every single row. And that's all there is to it. We just go back and forth, working those 2 rows again and again, and you're going to get this beautiful, stretchy, squishy brioche fabric that we all love so much. Now, I'm going to go back and show you how we cast on for this, because you have to work a setup row when you're getting ready to start brioche stitch. I showed you here on a fuller swatch just because it's easier to see how the live stitches interact with the appearance of rib on the fabric. But let's go back and do the cast on for this swatch. So there's no special cast on for brioche stitch. You can use any cast on you'd like. I have 25 stitches on my swatch here, so I've also cast on 25 stitches here to recreate exactly what I did when I was making this swatch earlier today. So I've got my 25 stitches here, cast on of your choice, anything is fine. Now we're going to work across the row, and here's how the setup row looks. I'm going to knit the first stitch. I'm going to bring yarn to front. You're going to slip the second stitch. Bring yarn to back over the needle, so you're creating that yarn over like we were when I was demoing the stitch earlier. And you're going to knit the third, bring yarn to the front, slip one, bring yarn to back over needle, knit one, bring yarn forward, slip one, bring it over top to the back, knit one. So we're essentially doing the same thing we were doing as we were working, but this is the row that we need to work so that we're setting up for that relationship of alternating a double stitch, single stitch, double stitch, single stitch, because in order to work the fabric as we demoed in the beginning, you have to have this setup on your needle. So I will continue across my setup row here, yarn forward, slip one, yarn over to the back, knit one, yarn forward, slip one, yarn over to the back, and knit one. Do that all the way across the row. You'll find that there's a very rhythmic feel to knitting brioche. Once it gets under your fingers, it goes very fast. Okay, here I am at the end. Slip the second to last stitch and then knit the last stitch. So now you can see I've worked my cast on of 25 stitches and one setup row, and it's much more difficult to sort of see how this relates than it is over here, but we essentially have the same thing now, which is every other stitch has a yarn over and every other stitch is a regular stitch. And now we would just begin working like we were over here, right into the setup row, back and forth, until the fabric grows. A couple quick tips or tricks to know about brioche stitch. The first one, if it's your first time knitting, it's going to be helpful for you to know that you need to knit about 1 inch to 1.5 inches before you actually see the pattern emerge. It's going to look a little different for the first few rows back and forth before the pattern establishes itself. So don't get discouraged in that first couple of rows if you don't feel like you're seeing that nice clear ribbing appear. Stick with it, knit through 1 inch or 2, and you'll start to see that ribbing appear, and that makes it much easier as you work to kind of know what you're doing at any given point, because you're either over a knit or over a purl column. The other thing about brioche stitch is that it is wider than it's a wider stitch gauge than the equivalent of stockinette stitch or a regular rib, meaning if you're casting on 25 stitches in brioche and you cast on 25 stitches in stockinette, your brioche stitch is actually going to measure wider than your stockinette stitches, and that has to do with the kind of double layer nature of the fabric. So keep that in mind as well. Brioche stitch also requires a slightly smaller needle than the equivalent stockinette stitch or other stitch pattern. So I'm working with a DK weight yarn here. Normally I would be knitting a DK weight yarn on a size 6 or 7, and for brioche stitch specifically I go down a couple needle sizes. So I'd be working brioche on a DK weight on a 4 or a 5, a US 4 or 5. So those are just some little tips to keep in mind when you're starting brioche and you want to make the best possible fabric that you can. And that is one color brioche worked flat.